The wind, a rabid phantom sculpted from glacial ice, and the serrated spines of the Arafo peaks hurled itself against Vivian Hartwell's rented Escalade with malicious force, a savage overture to the glacial dread already encasing her heart. Each gust felt like a judgment. The satellite phone, an expensive concession to her father's paranoia and her own precarious situation, shrilled from its cradle on the dashboard, an encrypted chime that tightened the icy knot in her stomach. Blocked ID. Of course. She jabbed the answer button, her voice a carefully modulated iciness she didn't feel. "Speak, Ms. Hartwell." The voice was a silken whisper devoid of inflection, yet heavy with menace, instantly recognizable as Hale Alistair Hartwell's most discreet, most lethal instrument of will. An unexpected and, shall we say, unauthorized deviation in your travel itinerary. Your father trusts your self-appointed fact-finding mission to assess the structural integrity of certain long-neglected family foundations will be expeditious. He has, as you know, a profound aversion to loose ends, particularly those he believed were snipped quite definitively 15 years ago. Ensure your characteristic silence remains golden, Vivian. Some mountain secrets you'll find are best left interred beneath a few thousand tons of unforgiving snow. Wouldn't you agree? The line clicked dead, leaving a void colder than the blizzard brewing outside. Maplewood. The name gouged into a rust-eaten, bullet-pocked sign, half swallowed by an avalanche's recent detritus, vibrated with the unspoken threat of Hale's call. This was no sentimental pilgrimage of remorse, not truly. This was a desperate, perhaps suicidal gambit, a last-ditch play against a patriarch whose global empire was cemented by the silent, brutal erasure of inconvenient truths. Truths embodied by the daughter she'd been forced to abandon, Lily. Her living, breathing secret. The raw, unhealed wound Alistair Hartwell had commanded her to excise from their gilded lineage, lest she face her own obliteration. His voice, sharp as shattered obsidian from that terrible night, still echoed in the soundproofed recesses of her memory. That aberration. He'd spat his drawing room, turned into a sterile operating theater for familial surgery, will be erased, Vivian. Permanently. You will ensure it, or I will ensure you are. His eyes, the precise shade of a winter storm front gathering over a desolate sea, had promised a finality beyond appeal, beyond even grief. The winding frost-heaved asphalt clawed at the SUV's tires, a treacherous ribbon clinging to the mountain's flank. Maplewood itself seemed to recoil at her approach, exhaling a collective frost-bitten sigh of wary resignation. Dilapidated cabins, their windows, like the vacant, hollowed eyes of long-dead prospectors, stared from beneath oppressive mantles of fresh snow. Their chimneys wept thin, spectral gray plumes into a sky the color of a week-old bruise. Here, the Hartwell name wasn't merely a faded whisper of departed Gilded Age affluence. It was a brand of visceral curse seared into the town's collective marrow. It was synonymous with betrayal, with local fortunes decimated overnight, by hostile takeovers, with farms foreclosed by predatory loans, with a chilling systemic disregard for the small, incandescent lives crushed beneath the iron wheels of Alistair's relentless ambition. The ancestral Hartwell estate, her unwilling destination, her potential fortress, or tomb, brooded on the town's frigid periphery, a decaying Gothic monument to a dynasty built on acquisition coercion and a chilling lack of conscience. Its gabled silhouette, a jagged tear against the turbulent, snow-laden sky, stirred not a flicker of nostalgia, only a primal, gut-wrenching fear, cold and sharp as the wind tearing at the car. 15 years. 15 years she'd lived a life of carefully constructed artifice in her gilded New York cage, a philanthropic veneer masking a core of cold, inherited ruthlessness. 15 years since she'd last seen Maplewood fleeing not just the town, but the unbearable weight of her own complicity. The informant's recent fragmented whispers had been the catalyst certain, Foundations are showing cracks, Vivian, the kind of cracks that can bring down an empire, if not mended with the right kind of silence. Or sacrifice. Sacrifice. The word had coiled in her gut. She knew with a sickening certainty that tasted like bile that the cracks her father was so anxious to mend were not in buildings, but in the wall of silence surrounding Lily's existence. Deep within a compact, surprisingly warm workshop, the air a comforting, honest balm of freshly sawn cedar aromatic pine and the faint, sharp tang of linseed oil. Jack Callahan's broad, calloused hands, instruments of quiet, meticulous creation, stilled their practiced glide across a length of bird's-eye maple, a disquiet sharp and unwelcome, as a splinter beneath a fingernail had pricked the edge of his consciousness moments before. He heard the Escalade's unfamiliar rumble. He wiped condensation from the frost-laced window pane with a rough thumb. The vehicle easing past Callahan Carpentry was an anomaly, a sleek, obsidian predator slinking through a flock of utilitarian pickup trucks and snow-worn station wagons. Something about its silent, purposeful glide, its heavily tinted windows concealing its occupant like state secrets, put him instantly on edge. He'd learned long ago, through hard, lonely years, forging a life from the mountain's grudging bounty, that in the secluded, insular heart of Maplewood, very little arrived by pure chance, and almost nothing remotely benevolent ever crawled from the Hartwell family's poisoned well. The last time a vehicle that expensive and out of place had been seen so close to town was a thought he quickly suppressed. Dad Lily's voice, a melody as bright and clear as a winter sunbeam slicing through shadow, cut through his unease. She burst through the side door, a flurry of dislodged snowflakes and vibrant, restless energy. Her cheeks flushed a becoming rose from the biting air, her dark hair escaping a haphazardly knitted, brightly colored cap. At 15, she was a whirlwind of youthful resilience, a vibrant, intricate carving of hope in the quiet, often stark landscape of his solitary life. Her eyes, a startling perceptive hazel that were so achingly like. No, he wouldn't let his mind wander down that treacherous, snow-covered path. She was Lily, his Lily. That was the only truth that mattered. Old Man Hemlock up at the Juniper Pass telemetry station just called in a red flag. Says the barometer's taken a nosedive straight off a cliff. Says the mountain's angry dad, truly angry, brewing up something monstrous. He's already calling it the Widowmaker's breath. Claims it's got teeth sharp enough to flay the bark off ancient pines this time. She shivered, a gesture not entirely born of the rapidly dropping temperature. The legend of Widow's Ravine and the whispered, half-forgotten tales of past storms claiming lives was woven into the fabric of Maplewood folklore. Jack grunted, a familiar rumbling sound that often served to mask deeper currents of concern. Town gossip and mountain superstition mostly. Hemlock enjoys his dramatics, always has. Needs an audience. He forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, which kept drifting towards the snow-dusted road where the black SUV had vanished in the direction of the old Hartwell place. The place where 15 years ago, a different kind of storm had broken, leaving devastation in its wake. Just be extra careful if you're heading out towards Mrs. Jensen's for those supplies. Stick to the main path, all right? No shortcuts through the woods today. Lily's perceptive gaze, so often a disconcerting mirror of his own unstated anxieties, followed his. Something spook you, Dad. You look like you've seen a Hartwell ghost. The jest was casual, tossed off with teenage bravado, but the name, even uttered lightly, seemed to thicken the air, to lower the temperature in the warm workshop by several degrees. He shook his head, attempting a nonchalance he was far from feeling. Just the weather. And maybe one too many cups of that bitter coffee Mrs. Jensen calls premium. But the unease clung to him like the persistent, fine scent of sawdust on his clothes, a premonition he couldn't quite articulate, but found impossible to ignore. It was the same feeling he'd had that night, 15 years ago, when an altogether different blacker storm had raged, and he'd found a miracle wrapped in near-frozen silk. That night, as the wind began its mournful, keening lament around the cabin eaves, a sound like the mountain itself, weeping Lily's questions about her origins, a recurring tender theme that had gained a new, almost urgent cadence in recent months, felt heavier, sharper, freighted with an unarticulated longing. She sat curled on the worn rag rug before the crackling hearth, her sketchbook open on her lap, but untouched, the charcoal stick idle in her fingers. "Do you ever think—" "She regretted it, Dad leaving me, I mean. My mother." Her voice was small, fragile, laced with a yearning that tore at Jack's carefully constructed, emotional barricades. Jack's hand roughened and gnarled by years of wrestling with recalcitrant wood, and the equally harsh realities of mountain life instinctively sought the small, intricately carved wooden bluebird perched on the mantelpiece. His very first gift to Lily, fashioned with trembling, inadequate fingers in the blurry, sleep-deprived days after he'd found her a tiny, frozen, impossibly precious miracle, swaddled in incongruously fine, though tattered and mud-stained blankets. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said, his voice gruff, with emotions he rarely allowed to surface a carefully guarded reservoir of pain and fiercely protective love. He moved from his worn armchair to sit beside her on the rug, pulling her close, inhaling the comforting, familiar scent of her shampoo and the lingering coldness of the outdoors that clung to her hair. "But what I do know, Lilybug with every fiber of my being, is that she missed out on the most extraordinary, most stubbornly beautiful, most fiercely alive thing that ever happened in this world." He never told her the full, unvarnished story of that night, never described the raw, abject terror etched onto the infant's tiny, blue-tinged face as he'd pulled her from the shallow, hastily dug snowdrift just off the treacherous, ice-slicked hairpin bend on Old Widow's Peak Road. A stretch of road locals avoided after dark, especially in winter, whispering that the spirit of a woman who'd perished there in a long-ago blizzard still wandered wailing for her lost child. Some older folks even muttered that a Hartwell carriage, its lamps extinguished, had been seen near there on a similarly stormy night generations ago, right before a local rival's homestead mysteriously burned to the ground. He never mentioned the scrap of heavy wine-colored silk clutched with surprising strength in one tiny frost-bitten fist. Silk far too luxurious, too opulent for any local, hinting at a desperate wealth and a world of secrets Maplewood rarely saw. He'd never told her about the faint, almost imperceptible tire tracks leading away from the desolate spot tracks made by expensive deep-tread tires too quickly obscured by the ferociously falling snow, or the lingering, cloying scent of an unfamiliar, costly perfume that had clung to the sodden blankets, a ghostly, taunting reminder of a world of privilege and cruelty far removed from his own. All he'd ever shown her was the tiny, brittle plastic hospital bracelet bearing no name, only the chillingly anonymous designation, "Baby Girl Hartwell," tucked away in his old fireproof lockbox. A name that, until today, until the arrival of that obsidian predator on wheels, he desperately hoped would remain a dormant, buried relic of a painful, resolutely closed chapter. He had also never told her about the furtive late-night visit he'd paid to Jedediah Thorne's dilapidated shack a week later after hushed, uneasy whispers had reached him in town about Thorne, a known drunkard and sometimes poacher, with a rumored willingness to do unpleasant work for outsiders, with deep pockets acting strangely agitated, muttering about rich folks' messes and babies better off lost if they knew what was good for 'em. Thorne had been too drunk or too scared to say anything coherent, but Jack had left with a colder knot of dread in his stomach, a dread that had never entirely dissipated. The following morning, the air was sharp and brittle, each breath a spike of jagged ice in the lungs. Vivian Hartwell, her composure a meticulously constructed armor of Chanel and steely hard-won resolve, stood before the unassuming snow-dusted facade of Callahan Carpentry. The simple, hand-painted sign depicting a stylized pine tree and the words, "Callahan Carpentry, quality craftsmanship, felt so incongruous with the magnitude of its connection to her fractured secret past, it sent a fresh tremor of trepidation through her. The private investigators sanitized discreetly watermarked reports delivered to her years ago via layers of corporate cutouts, had been clinical detached referring to subject infant unidentified and guardian Callahan Jack. This was real. This was the man who had, for reasons she couldn't begin to fathom and dared not hope were purely altruistic, raised her child, her Lily. She'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times during the sleepless, anxiety-ridden nights, crafting an impenetrable narrative. An estranged heiress, emotionally detached, returning merely to reclaim a long-neglected family property, a plausible, sterile fiction, to mask the seething chaos within. But as the workshop door creaked open on well-oiled hinges and Jack Callahan himself filled the frame, his silhouette stark and imposing against the warm, inviting amber glow, from within the carefully constructed words dissolved on her tongue like snowflakes. His gaze was direct, unwavering, and held an unnerving, almost preternatural perceptiveness that seemed to strip away her defenses layer by layer, like peeling bark from a tree. He wasn't what she'd expected from the grainy long-lens surveillance photos in the investigators' files. There was a quiet, formidable strength about him, a rootedness that bespoke a man intimately familiar with hardship, but unbent perhaps, even strengthened by it. His eyes, the startling, changeable color of a winter sky just before a storm breaks, held a deep, abiding weariness, but also a flicker of something fiercely, indomitably protective. "You looking for someone, ma'am?" His voice was deep, resonant, with a gravelly undertone that spoke of disuse, or perhaps of a man who chose his words with deliberate, unhurried care. The frigid air seemed to solidify around her, trapping her breath. Vivian Hartwell. She managed the name feeling alien and heavy as a millstone on her tongue. She extended a gloved hand, the supple black leather expensive, a stark, jarring contrast to the raw, snowy landscape and his work-worn aura. The name hung in the air between them, supercharged with unspoken history, with the suffocating weight of 15 years of silence, lies, and unimaginable loss. She saw a flicker in his eyes. Not surprise, she realized with a disorienting jolt that sent her heart lurching, but a dawning, weary recognition, mixed with an immediate, profound apprehension that mirrored the town's own uneasy, bitter relationship with her family name. I've recently inherited the old Hartwell property. She continued, her voice smoother now, recovering a sliver of her boardroom poise, though a faint, betraying tremor still vibrated beneath the surface. It's been allowed to fall into considerable disrepair. It requires rather extensive repairs, a complete restoration, in fact. It was a plausible enough lie, she told herself, a carefully chosen temporary foothold in this treacherous, unfamiliar new terrain. Jack's grip, when he finally took her offered hand, was firm, surprisingly warm, his calloused palm a stark, grounding contrast to her manicured softness. "The Hartwell place," he said, his voice carefully, almost unnervingly neutral, though his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, a subtle tightening around the sun-weathered crinkles at their corners. "Been sitting empty and cold for a long, long time. Most folks around here figured it'd fall to ruin and be swallowed by the forest before another Hartwell ever dared set foot in Maplewood again." He studied her then, a slow, deliberate, assessing gaze that made her feel utterly exposed, as if he could see straight through the expensive cashmere coat, through the layers of carefully constructed defenses, to the terrified, fractured woman beneath. "It's a mammoth undertaking, Ms. Hartwell. A beast of a job. Especially with winter tightening its grip like a hangman's noose around this valley. Are you quite sure you're prepared for what that truly entails?" His eyes held a distinct challenge and something else. A profound, knowing sadness that pricked at her conscience like a hidden thorn. 15 years is a long shadow. he added, his voice dropping slightly. Some things once broken don't mend easily. Some stains don't wash out no matter how hard you scrub. Their initial interactions became a complex, unspoken negotiation, a fragile, perilous dance of half-truths, carefully veiled intentions, and palpable, unspoken anxieties. Vivienne, acutely, terrifyingly aware of the ticking clock of her father's potential interference and the inherent precariousness of her secrets, formally hired Jack for the cabin's restoration. The arrangement was a flimsy, almost transparent pretext, a temporary rickety bridge across the yawning chasm of their unacknowledged, explosive connection. Lily, drawn by an irresistible, almost magnetic curiosity towards this elegant, enigmatic woman who had so suddenly materialized from the swirling mists of her unknown, longed-for past, found herself spending more and more time at the dilapidated, ice-encrusted Hartwell estate. Ostensibly, she was there to assist her father fetching tools, sweeping away layers of dust and rodent droppings, or brewing coffee on a portable gas stove. But in reality, she was an avid, almost preternaturally sharp observer, her keen young eyes, so much like Vivienne's own, missing precious little. She saw the hairline cracks in Vivienne's polished, impervious facade, the fleeting shadows of profound, visceral fear that flickered in Vivienne's eyes when she thought no one was watching, especially when she answered hushed, urgent calls on her satellite phone. She noticed the almost imperceptible tremor in Vivienne's hands when she picked up a faded, water-stained photograph of unknown children from a dust-laden mantelpiece, or a forgotten, tarnished silver locket found tucked away in a rotting drawer. The town, too, watched its collective gaze, a palpable presence. Mrs. Jensen, from behind the cluttered counter of her general store, her gaze as sharp and penetrating as her famously potent homemade pickles, offered clipped, though not entirely unkind, observations on the Hartwell nerve. Doc Miller, his kindly crinkled eyes, holding a universe of unspoken local history, spoke often of the unforgiving harshness of mountain winters and the stubborn, often surprising resilience of its people. His words frequently carrying a subtle, unspoken meaning directed squarely at Vivienne. Maplewood had long, unforgiving memories, and the Hartwell legacy was a particularly bitter, festering one woven into the very fabric of the town's history. With tales of foreclosed farms that had been in families for generations, of abruptly broken promises, of local investment, of a ruthless, single-minded pursuit of profit that had left deep, unhealed scars on more than one family, on the town's very soul. Vivienne felt their collective gaze, sometimes openly curious, sometimes laced with suspicion, always intensely, uncomfortably appraising. The storm-old man Hemlock had prophesied the widowmaker's breath, arrived not with a gentle, poetic prelude, but with a savage, sudden, blindsiding fury, as if the mountain itself, enraged by some unseen transgression, had decided to unleash its full pent-up primordial wrath. It descended upon Maplewood like an invading army of ice and wind, transforming the familiar, beloved landscape into an alien, utterly inhospitable wasteland of swirling, suffocating white. Days blurred into a relentless, disorienting onslaught of screaming wind, zero visibility, and blinding, horizontally driven snow, imprisoning residents in their homes, severing power lines, phone connections, and any hope of contact with the outside world. Each cabin became an isolated, besieged fortress against the storm's relentless assault. It was during the suffocating, claustrophobic intimacy of this enforced confinement, with the wind clawing at Jack's small, sturdy cabin, like a tormented, malevolent spirit trying to gain entry, that the meticulously constructed dam of Vivienne's composure finally catastrophically broke. Jack, his patience worn thin to a dangerous thread by her evasiveness, his sharp mountain intuition screaming that this woman was hiding something far more significant, far more dangerous than a mere desire to renovate a derelict cabin, cornered her. His questions, usually gentle and considerate, born of a deep-seated respect for personal boundaries, became pointed, relentless, stripping away her remaining tattered defenses like bark from a storm-felled tree. Lily, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere, The palpable tension arcing between the two adults like downed power lines sat huddled by the fire. Her sketchbook lying forgotten on the floor, her eyes wide and apprehensive, darting between Jack's grim, determined face and Vivian's increasingly fragile one. "This isn't just about a house, is it, Vivian?" Jack's voice was low, insistent, cutting through the howl of the wind. "This fear you carry, it's more than just about your father's disapproval of you being here. It's about Lily, isn't it? What don't I know? What aren't you telling me? Lily isn't just some abandoned child whose tragic past I stumbled upon some vague information about in old dusty family records." Vivian's voice finally cracked at the words. Raw, bleeding each syllable, an agonizing, torturous admission that tore through her with the force of a physical blow. The opulent New York penthouse, the formidable power suits the carefully cultivated aura of invincible corporate command. All of it felt like a hollow, distant, ludicrous dream. Here, in this rustic, firelit cabin, stripped bare by the elemental fury of the storm, and Jack's unwavering, relentlessly perceptive gaze, she was just a woman, drowning in the icy, churning wreckage of her past. "She's my daughter, Jack. My daughter." The silence that crashed down upon them was heavier, more suffocating, more absolute than the tons of snow piling relentlessly against the cabin walls. The only sound for an eternity was the relentless, furious, inhuman howl of the wind, a fitting, desolate soundtrack to the cataclysmic implosion of their carefully ordered, fragile worlds. Lily, who had been watching them with a dawning, horrified, almost disbelieving understanding flickering in her wide eyes, froze as if turned to stone. Her charcoal pencil, clutched tightly in her fingers, clattered unheeded to the rough-hewn wooden floor. Her face, moments before, animated with the innocent absorption of her art, turned a ghostly ashen white, her eyes, enormous dark pools of disbelief, rapidly filling with a dawning, terrible, uncomprehending pain. Jack's expression, which had been etched with a frustrated, impatient concern, hardened into something Vivian couldn't immediately decipher. Not anger, not yet, but a profound, wounded incredulity. A sense of betrayal that seemed to cut deeper than any physical blow could. 15 years, Vivian. He said, his voice low, gravelly, almost unearthly, each word dropping into the supercharged silence like a heavy stone into a still, deep well. 15 years you let us believe. You let her believe. She was utterly alone, unwanted, a piece of driftwood washed up on my shore. His gaze flickered to Lily, a look of such profound pain and dawning anger that Vivian flinched. I was terrified. Vivian cried, the carefully constructed walls of her composure finally crumbling into dust, the sound a desperate raw sob. The image of her father's face, cold, implacable, utterly without mercy, swam before her eyes. "You don't understand. You can't possibly understand my father. Alistair. He's not just a powerful, influential man. He's ruthless. He's capable of anything. He swore to me he'd erase her, make her disappear as if she had never existed, as if I'd never borne her. He had an associate here in Maplewood, a man named Jedediah Thorne. Thorne was paid handsomely to ensure Lily, to ensure she wasn't found alive." The horrifying words, finally spoken aloud, hung in the air, reeking of death and desperation. His reach is extensive. Coming back here even now was a desperate, insane gamble, a risk I only dared to take because my most trusted informant whispers that Thorne might have become unreliable, perhaps developed a belated flicker of conscience, or more likely simply got greedy after Alistair stopped paying him off. They said Alistair's grip on some of his old arrangements in this town were unraveling, that Thorne might be willing to talk for the right price. Lily scrambled to her feet, her slight frame trembling with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. Her eyes, those startling hazel eyes that were a painful living mirror of Vivian's own, blazing with a maelstrom of conflicting, agonizing emotions. Utter confusion, devastating betrayal, and a raw, burgeoning anger that was terrifying in its sudden, untamed intensity. You're my mother." The words were a disbelieving whisper, choked with unshed tears, each syllable laden with the weight of a lifetime of unspoken questions and imagined scenarios. "And you left me. You abandoned me in a snowstorm to die because of him. Because you were afraid." She looked from Vivienne's anguished, tear-streaked face to Jack's stricken, suddenly unreadable one. Her gaze sharp as a shard of glacial ice, fixed on Jack, her anchor, her protector, her world. "Did you know, Dad?" she demanded, her voice cracking raw with betrayal. "All this time, all these years, did you know about her? Did you know who she was? Did you know about this thorn and why I was really left out there? What else haven't you told me?" "No, Lilybug, I swear to you on my life, I never knew she was your mother," Jack said, his voice hoarse, raw with his own profound shock and a dawning, sickening horror at the full implications of Vivienne's confession and the dark memory of Thorne's drunken, incoherent ramblings from years ago. I saw a dark, expensive car that night, way up near Widow's Peak, a woman's silhouette, frantic, looking like she was arguing with someone. But it was gone in the driving snow before I could get a clear look. I only ever knew I found you a miracle. Thorne. Thorne was just a town drunk, a bitter, unpredictable loner. I never made that terrible connection. I swear, Lily. But even as he said it, a cold doubt, a flicker of past unexamined suspicions about Thorne's sudden, albeit temporary, access to money around that time pricked at his conscience. Had he subconsciously chosen not to look too closely, Lily shook her head, backing away from them both as if they were sources of some deadly contagion, her face a mask of unbearable pain and disillusionment. I can't. Tears streamed down her face, now hot and angry, each one a tiny testament to her shattered world. "You're lying, both of you. This is some kind of sick, twisted joke. It has to be." Her voice cracked, breaking on a sob. Blindly fueled by a desperate, overwhelming need to escape the suffocating weight of this devastating, world-altering revelation, she grabbed her coat. A bright yellow parka, usually a beacon of cheerfulness, now a cruel mockery of the turmoil within, and flung open the cabin door. Before either adult, stunned into momentary paralysis by the speed and intensity of her reaction, could react, before the full, terrifying import of her desperate flight truly registered, she plunged out into the howling white chaos of the blizzard, disappearing almost instantly into the swirling, malevolent vortex of snow and wind. Lily Jack roared, his voice a raw, primal sound of pure animal terror, lunging for the door. His earlier shock instantly vaporized by a far more immediate, consuming fear. Vivienne, galvanized by a sudden, overwhelming surge of primal fear that eclipsed even her own carefully cultivated detachment, her own lingering, bone-deep terror. Of her father was right behind him, her expensive, inadequate city boots, ill-suited for the rapidly deepening snowdrifts already piling against the cabin walls. The sanctity of the warm, fire-lit cabin was brutally violated, the fragile temporary peace shattered, replaced by a new, more immediate and far more terrifying storm, raging both outside and within their hearts. The blizzard was a living, malevolent entity, a maelstrom of razor-sharp ice and brutal, disorienting wind that clawed at their exposed faces, stole their breath, and rendered the familiar, cherished landscape an unrecognizable, hostile wilderness. Visibility dropped to near zero in seconds, and the world reduced to a suffocating, swirling, featureless whiteness. "We have to split up." Jack yelled, his voice hoarse, already strained, barely audible above the storm's demonic, unrelenting shriek, his face a grim, desperate mask of determination. "Cover more, Groundhead, towards the old trapper's path along Raven Creek. She sometimes goes there to think when she's upset. Stay within earshot. If you can use your whistle, Lily, Lily. Vivienne, heedless of her inappropriate, rapidly soaking attire, plunged into the treacherous thigh-deep drifts, driven by a desperate visceral urgency that matched, if not surpassed, Jack's. The biting, unimaginable cold was a physical blow searing her lungs with each ragged, inadequate breath. But the thought of Lily, her daughter, her flesh and blood, alone betrayed terrified and lost in this monstrous, unforgiving tempest, fueled an unnatural, almost inhuman strength, a ferocious maternal instinct she hadn't known she possessed until this terrifying moment. Hours crawled by, an eternity spent battling the frozen hell of screaming wind, blinding snow, and the gnawing, insidious teeth of despair. They stumbled, fell, rose, and pushed on their bodies, protesting their hope, eroding with each passing minute. Jack's powerful shouts, calling Lily's name, grew hoarser, weaker, increasingly swallowed by the storm's insatiable, deafening roar. Vivienne's own calls, thinner, more desperate, were ripped away by the gale before they could travel more than a few feet, lost in the white maelstrom. The fragile, flickering hope that had ignited within her when she'd made the decision to come to Maplewood began to dim, threatening to be utterly extinguished by the overwhelming, icy, brutal reality of their desperate, seemingly hopeless situation. Once Vivienne stumbled into a hidden ditch, the snow giving way beneath her and Jack, his face etched with a terrifying blend of fear. For her and for Lily had to physically haul her out, his own strength visibly waning. It was Vivienne, her legs aching beyond endurance, her body numb to the core with penetrating cold, her spirit teetering on the very brink of utter collapse, who found the first heartbreaking damning sign. A small, brightly colored mitten knitted in a cheerful rainbow pattern. Lily favored a pattern Vivienne now recognized with a fresh stab of agony from the few items of Lily's clothing she'd glimpsed in the cabin. It was snagged on the skeletal, ice-encrusted branch of a wind-blasted pine, perilously, sickeningly close to the treacherous, ice-slicked, overhanging lip of Widow's Ravine. Locals steeped in generations of mountain lore and superstitious dread superstitiously avoided the ravine even in good weather, claiming it was cursed, haunted by the mournful spirit of a pioneer woman who had perished there along with her child in a blizzard centuries ago. The same legend that whispered darkly of a Hartwell ancestor's possible involvement in some long-forgotten tragedy connected to the spot. A fresh wave of absolute terror, cold and sharp as a shard of glacial ice, pierced through Vivienne's dwindling reserves of strength and sanity. Her breath hitched, caught in her throat like a physical obstruction, peering down into the swirling, nauseating abyss through a momentary, sickening lull in the driving snow. That felt like the storm taking a cruel breath. She saw it. A small, almost indiscernible flash of bright yellow Lily's parka. A horrifyingly still terribly small splash of color against the monochrome desolation partway down the steep, snow-choked, unstable incline, nestled precariously, ominously against a jutting outcrop of black, ice-sheathed rock. A small snowslide perhaps dislodged by Lily's fall or the storm's vibrations had partially chillingly buried her. Jack, over here. The ravine. Oh my God, Jack, I've found her, Widow's Ravine. Oh God, Jack, her scream raw with undiluted terror, and a sliver of desperate, almost unbearable hope was nearly torn from her throat by the resurgent wind, but he heard it. His own anguished, animalistic cry answering hers as he stumbled, gasping through the deep drifts towards her, his face a mask of dread. Reaching Lily was a descent into a frozen, treacherous nightmare. The slope was a dangerous, unstable patchwork of loose, wind-packed snow, hidden sheets of treacherous ice, and jagged, unforgiving rocks. Jack, his intimate knowledge of the mountain's treacherous terrain, and their only slim, desperate advantage somehow miraculously managed to find and then anchor a length of stiff, frozen rope. scavenged from a dilapidated, half-buried trapper's lean-to they'd blindly stumbled past hours earlier in their frantic search, a forgotten relic from a bygone era, to the sturdy, deeply rooted trunk of an ancient, wind-twisted pine that clung stubbornly to the ravine's edge. Vivienne, surprisingly agile, her movements fueled by an adrenaline-charged desperation that bordered on madness, utterly fearless now. In her singular, all-consuming focus on reaching her daughter, began the perilous, near-vertical descent. She scrabbled and slid heedless of the sharp rocks that tore at her expensive, inadequate clothes and scraped her already frozen skin raw. The biting, relentless wind, a constant, malevolent, screaming presence, trying to rip her from her precarious hold. She reached Lily, who lay frighteningly, unnaturally still, her face pale and waxy against the vibrant, mocking yellow of her hood, a nasty bleeding gash marring the smooth skin of her forehead, just above her delicate eyebrow. A small, ominous pool of darker snow was forming beneath her head. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, almost imperceptible. "Lily, Lily, darling, can you hear me? It's Mom." The word so long forbidden, so long yearned for, felt foreign, yet achingly profoundly right on her tongue, a desperate prayer. There was no response, not even a flicker of an eyelid. Panic, cold, sharp, and acidic, surged through Vivienne, threatening to paralyze her. Working with frantic, fumbling, numb fingers, she cleared the snow from Lily's face and chest, then checked for a pulse at her neck. Weak, thready, terrifyingly faint, but there. Alive. For now. The ascent with Lily's limp, unresponsive dead weight, an agonizing, almost unbearable burden, became a torturous, protracted, seemingly endless battle against the unrelenting, merciless elements, against the treacherous, unstable incline, against their own rapidly depleting, inadequate reserves of strength, warmth, and hope. Jack, his face a grim, contorted mask of superhuman exertion and raw terror, hauled from above his powerful muscles, screaming in audible protest, with every inch gained the rope biting cruelly into his frozen, bleeding hands. Vivienne, bracing herself precariously from below, pushed and guided Lily's unresponsive form. Her own body battered, bruised, and trembling violently from cold. And effort her mind, a chaotic maelstrom of desperate prayers, bargains with any deity who might listen, and waves of suffocating self-recrimination. Each inch gained felt like a monumental, hard-won victory, each tiny slip on the ice or dislodged rock a terrifying, heart-stopping prelude to utter disaster. Back in the blessed, encompassing, life-affirming warmth of Jack's small, sturdy cabin, the air thick with the primitive, comforting scent of wood smoke, fear, damp wool, and the sharp, antiseptic smell from Doc Miller's bag, the town's aging, overworked doctor, his weathered face etched with a grim concern that did little to reassure them. Worked with quiet, practiced, blessedly efficient urgency over Lily's still small form. He cleaned and meticulously stitched the deep, ragged gash on her forehead, administered an injection for the burgeoning, dangerously high fever that was now evident, wrapped her frail body in a cocoon of warm, dry blankets piled high. "Nasty concussion," he pronounced, finally, his voice gravelly from fatigue and concern, turning from Lily's bedside. "Significant hypothermia bordering on severe. That cuts deep enough to leave a prominent scar. But she's a strong girl, Jack. Tough mountain stock, that one, through and through." He cast a quick, unexpectedly appraising glance at Vivienne, who stood shivering uncontrollably by the fire wrapped in one of Jack's oversized rough wool blankets, a flicker of something unreadable, respect, pity, accusation, in his old, tired eyes. "You two got to her just in the nick of time. Another hour out there? Maybe even less. Well, let's not dwell on what might have been." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The unspoken, horrifying words hung in the superheated air, heavy and terrifying. Lily remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and alarmingly erratic for many long hours, a fragile pale ghost adrift in a sea of mounded blankets, her stillness a constant agonizing torment to Vivienne and Jack. As Lily finally drifted into a more stable, though still deeply unconscious sleep, her breathing slowly evening out, though still far too shallow for genuine comfort, a new, more insidious, man-made storm began to brew outside, one that had nothing to do with the slowly abating blizzard. Headlights sharp and cutting as shards of surgical steel sliced with arrogant confidence through the lingering, swirling snow and deepening twilight. A sleek, dark, menacingly powerful SUV, its tires crunching with aggressive, unwelcome confidence on the freshly fallen, untrodden snow of Jack's isolated driveway, rumbled to an insolent halt outside the cabin. The vehicle was utterly, jarringly out of place in Maplewood, a harbinger of a different, colder, more calculated kind of threat. A man emerged tall and impeccably, almost unnaturally dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored cashmere overcoat, despite the remnants of the blizzard still swirling in the frigid, biting air. His face was a study in urbane, chilling impassivity, utterly devoid of discernible warmth or human emotion. He moved with a quiet, lethal, almost reptilian grace, his polished, expensive city shoes leaving neat, incongruous, violating prints in the deep, otherwise undisturbed snow. It was Hale. And trailing reluctantly, nervously behind him, looking like a broken, haunted old man, his shoulders stooped, his eyes darting around fearfully, was Jedediah Thorne. Vivienne Hale's voice was soft, almost a silken purr, yet it carried the unmistakable, chillingly absolute authority of his employer, Alistair Hartwell. He stepped uninvited into the small, warm cabin, his gaze sweeping with cold, dismissive arrogance over Jack, then lingering with a disquieting, predatory intensity on Lily's sleeping, vulnerable form on the makeshift bed near the fire. Thorne shuffled in behind him, wringing his gnarled, frost-bitten hands, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, his face a mask of misery and fear. "Your father is considerably, I might even say profoundly, displeased." He was under the distinct impression, reinforced by Mr. Thorne's previous, shall we say, lucrative assurances that this particular loose end was securely tied up permanently many, many years ago. It appears certain old associates in this charmingly rustic, if somewhat unreliable locale became regrettably undependable after a certain point in time. An unfortunate lapse in their prior contractual commitments leading to this untidy situation. His eyes cold and flat as river stones polished smooth by eons of icy water met Vivienne's. Thorne visibly flinched at the implied threat. "Alistair requires your immediate return to New York. Alone. There are urgent matters pertaining to the Hartwell Foundation that demand your undivided attention and complete compliance." The veiled threat, the chilling, unambiguous implication beneath the urbane, polished words, was as clear and as sharp as the ice still forming on the cabin's window panes. Her father hadn't just wanted Lily gone from Vivienne's life. He had likely taken active, brutal steps using Thorne as his local instrument to ensure the infant child was never found, perhaps even to ensure she didn't survive that terrible winter night. Jack's fortuitous, compassionate discovery had unknowingly, miraculously thwarted that dark, unspoken, murderous directive. Thorne Vivienne now surmised, with a sickening, icy lurch in her stomach, must have been the one who, perhaps fearing Alistair's eventual discovery of his failure, or perhaps driven by a belated, insufficient flicker of conscience, or most likely simply by pure, desperate greed, had finally alerted Alistair's network to Vivienne's unexpected return to Maplewood, and crucially to her clandestine, rapidly solidifying connection to the girl everyone in town believed was simply Jack Callahan's quietly adopted daughter. Vivienne's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about familial disapproval or a tarnished society reputation. This was about an old, cruel, and potentially lethal directive resurfacing with terrifying, unstoppable force. This was about Alistair Hartwell, ensuring no inconvenient, damaging truths from his past or from his daughters ever saw the unforgiving light of day. This was about final, absolute erasure. Jack, who had been standing in the shadowy alcove by the kitchen doorway, his face grim, when overhearing the chilling, damning exchange, stepped forward. His large, powerful frame instinctively, subtly, yet unmistakably positioning himself between Hale and Vivienne, and more importantly, more defiantly, between Hale and Lily's bed. The quiet, almost passive, laconic demeanor he usually wore had vanished completely, replaced by a fierce, primal protective fire that blazed in his narrowed eyes, a territorial defense of his child and of the woman who, despite everything, despite the lies and the years of silence, was undeniably her mother. "She's not going anywhere." Jack stated, his voice a low, dangerous growl, and the sound of a normally placid, reasonable man pushed far beyond his considerable limit. "And neither is her daughter. Not with you, not with anyone. You can tell Alistair Hartwell that himself." Hale's lips curved into a mirthless, almost reptilian smile, a mere stretching of skin over bone. "Mr. Callahan, I presume." His gaze flickered dismissively over Jack, sizing him up and finding him wanting. "You misunderstand the delicate nuances of the current, rather unfortunate situation. This is not a request. It is a directive from a man who is singularly unaccustomed to having his directives questioned, let alone ignored." He glanced pointedly, meaningfully towards Lily's still vulnerable form. "It would be most unfortunate if further, shall we say, complications were to arise for the girl. Accidents, as you well know from very recent, very vivid experience, can happen all too easily, especially in such a harsh, remote, and unforgiving environment. Perhaps Mr. Thorne," here he gestured dismissively at the trembling older man, "could elaborate on how final certain arrangements can be made when deemed necessary, even after a considerable passage of time." Thorne let out a small, choked whimper, his face ashen. Vivienne felt a surge of cold, righteous fury, a powerful, cleansing defiance forged in the icy crucible of Widow's Ravine, and tempered by the fierce, undeniable, elemental love she now unequivocally felt for the daughter she had almost lost twice. Once to her father's cruelty, once to the mountain's wrath. The fear of her father, a fear that had shadowed and crippled her entire existence, was still there, a cold, tight knot in her stomach. But it was now abruptly, decisively eclipsed by a more powerful, more urgent, more fundamental imperative. "Tell my father," she said, her voice shaking but surprisingly resolute, each word carefully chosen, weighted with a conviction that surprised even herself, "that I am staying here in Maplewood. This is my home now, and Lily is my daughter. If he attempts to interfere, if he tries anything at all to harm her or to coerce me, he will discover that I have learned a few things about ruthlessness and leverage myself, perhaps even directly from him. I have resources and information he would not want made public." She met Hale's cold, appraising gaze without flinching, her chin high. "Some foundations, Mr. Hale, once they are truly cracked, can never be properly mended, no matter how much power or money is thrown at them. And some secrets, particularly those buried in snow and deceit, have a nasty way of finding the light, no matter how deeply or for how long they are buried." Hale's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something. Surprise, grudging respect, sheer disbelief, momentarily disturbing their cold, impassive reptilian depths. He held her gaze for a long, charged, silent moment, then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "A bold, if rather foolhardy stance, Miss Hartwell. Your father will be thoroughly, and I assure you accurately, informed of your decision and of your rather colorful sentiments. He turned with the same silent, predatory grace with which he had entered and left the cabin. Thorne stumbling blindly, desperately after him like a condemned man seeking an escape that didn't exist. The sound of the SUV's powerful engine roaring to life and then retreating into the snow-swept dark night was a fading guttural growl. He left behind an unspoken palpable threat, a chilling unambiguous promise of severe far-reaching repercussions hanging heavy and suffocating in the warm, suddenly fragile firelit air. The battle lines had been irrevocably drawn. The days that followed were a fragile, uncertain, nerve-wracking truce, both within the besieged walls of Jack's small cabin and in the wider, watching, whispering community of Maplewood. Lily, slowly, painstakingly recovering from her profound physical and emotional ordeal, was withdrawn her justifiable anger and deep sense of betrayal, a palpable, almost visible barrier between herself and Vivian. She wrestled silently, often tearfully, with the shattered ghost of an idealized, imagined mother, a comforting phantom of unconditional love and acceptance. She had cherished for years versus the flawed, frightened, yet now fiercely, unexpectedly protective reality of the woman who now sat by her bedside for hours, her eyes filled with a raw pain, a profound regret and a desperate yearning love that Lily was only just beginning tentatively, fearfully, to comprehend. The revelation had shattered the bedrock of her young life, leaving her adrift in a turbulent, disorienting sea of confusing, conflicting emotions. "Why didn't you ever try to find me before?" she'd asked Vivian one afternoon, her voice small but accusatory. "Was I so easy to forget? Was your fear of him greater than any love you might have felt for me?" Vivienne could only answer with the raw, painful truth of her terror. Her youth and her father's absolute suffocating control, an explanation Lily found difficult, almost impossible to accept. Jack, now acutely, terrifyingly aware of the true, sinister, almost sociopathic nature of Vivian's past, and the looming, undefined, but undoubtedly lethal threat of Alistair Hartwell's retribution, became her unwavering, albeit often silent, shield. His quiet, steady, reassuring support, his deep, intuitive understanding of the mountain's capricious moods and the Hartwell family's equally destructive, corrosive influence, became a bedrock, a lifeline for Vivienne as she navigated this treacherous new reality. He spoke little of his own fears, his own churning anger at Alistair, but his actions, the meticulous way he now checked and reinforced the cabin's locks and windows each night, the new wary, hawk-like scrutiny he cast upon any unfamiliar vehicle that dared to pass on the quiet road, and the quiet, focused hours he spent meticulously cleaning and oiling his old, reliable hunting rifle. Its presence now, a grimly comforting constant by the hearth, spoke volumes, a silent testament to his resolve. Slowly, painstakingly, Vivian began the arduous, monumental task of rebuilding more than just the dilapidated, ice-encrusted, emotionally freighted shell of the Hartwell cabin on the edge of town. She began to attempt with hesitant fumbling, often clumsy steps to rebuild the shattered, splintered fragments of her relationship with her daughter. She shared stories with Lily, not of the glittering, soulless galas and sterile, cutthroat boardrooms of her New York existence, but of her own constrained, fear-laced, emotionally barren upbringing, of her youthful mistakes and overwhelming immaturity, of the crushing, suffocating weight of her father's tyrannical expectations, of a regret so profound, so all-consuming. It had hollowed out her soul for 15 long years, of a desperate, deeply buried, yet unextinguishable love for the child she had been brutally forced to abandon. She faced the revived, often hostile whispers and cold, suspicious stares of the Maplewood townsfolk, the renewed morbid speculation about the Hartwells' dark, sordid past, with a newfound surprising courage. A resilience born from her desperate defining stand against her father's formidable emissary. She hired local contractors for the Hartwell estate restoration, deliberately bypassing Alistair's usual network of corporate entities, paying fair, even generous wages, using her considerable personal resources. access to which she knew Alistair would soon try to sever. To quietly, subtly mend some of the old festering wounds her family had inflicted upon the beleaguered community over generations, a small, hopelessly inadequate penance for decades of Hartwell greed and callous disregard. Jack in turn taught Vivienne not just the practical, tangible skills of repairing crumbling stone foundations and replacing rotten, decaying timbers, but the more intricate, more challenging, more essential art of trusting, of leaning on someone, of allowing vulnerability, of accepting help. He saw with his quiet, discerning eyes the strong, resilient, compassionate woman struggling desperately to emerge from beneath the polished, brittle, carefully constructed shell of the Hartwell heiress, the Ice Queen. Their shared, terrifying, near-fatal ordeal in the storm. The raw, primal fear they had faced and overcome together in the desperate, collaborative fight to save Lily had forged an undeniable, unspoken, unbreakable bond between them. A profound connection that transcended mere words. A quiet, intuitive understanding that resonated in the shared companionable silences as they worked side by side day after day, restoring the old haunted cabin that was rapidly, unexpectedly becoming a tangible symbol of Vivienne's tenuous, courageous reclamation of her stolen past and her hesitant, uncertain yet determined steps towards an unknown, unguaranteed future. Maplewood's annual winter festival, a cherished, deeply ingrained local tradition that Vivienne in her former sterile life would have undoubtedly scorned as a quaint, unsophisticated, hopelessly provincial anachronism, became an unexpected, poignant, transformative turning point. The small town square festooned with strings of softly glowing, multicolored Christmas lights that cast a magical, inviting glow on the fresh snow, buzzed with the cheerful, bundled-up chatter of local families, the warm, inviting scent of mulled cider, roasting chestnuts, and pine smoke mingling with the crisp, clean, invigorating mountain air. Children, their faces bright with unadulterated excitement, shrieked with infectious laughter as they tumbled and slid in the deep snowdrifts, their mittened hands clutching hastily made imperfect snowballs. Lily, coaxed gently by Jack and encouraged by a surprisingly supportive Doc Miller. Her voice still a little hesitant, a little fragile, but gaining strength and confidence. With each tentative note, stood on the small makeshift wooden stage erected in the center of the square, an old battered, well-loved acoustic guitar cradled in her arms. She sang a song, her own composition, a melody born from the tumultuous, roiling emotions of the preceding, life-altering weeks. The lyrics, simple, raw, almost painfully honest and achingly poignant, spoke of brutal winter storms, of lost, uncertain paths, of hidden, festering wounds, and of the unexpected, fragile, almost unbelievable discovery of a flickering light, a tentative warmth in the darkest, coldest, most unexpected of places. As her clear, sweet, surprisingly powerful voice, imbued with a soulful wisdom far beyond her 15 years, soared over the hushed, attentive square, her eyes, those startling, unforgettable hazel eyes, found Vivienne's across the crowded, firelit space. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, not fully. That would take much more time, much more healing. But it was an opening, a discernible thawing, a tentative, fragile bridge being extended across the deep, painful chasm of hurt and betrayal. A fragile bud of understanding, of possibility. Vivienne felt a tight, painful lump form in her throat. Tears stinging her eyes, blurring the festive lights, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the crackling, welcoming bonfire nearby. Vivienne knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, despite the festival's infectious warmth, that her father wouldn't let go easily. His monumental pride, his insatiable pathological need for absolute control, his ingrained reptilian ruthlessness would demand retribution, would demand her submission or her destruction. There would undoubtedly be protracted, vicious legal battles, insidious, carefully orchestrated attempts to manipulate and freeze her finances, calculated reputation-shattering campaigns to discredit her in the eyes of the powerful, judgmental world she had once navigated with such effortless, unthinking command. But as she stood there, under the softly, gently falling snow, watching Lily's courageous, heartfelt, soul-bearing performance. Feeling the reassuring grounding pressure of Jack's strong, calloused hand resting gently on her arm, she felt a profound, unshakable peace, a deep, resonant sense of belonging. She hadn't realized she'd been so desperately, so completely seeking her entire, unfulfilled life. She had made her choice. Maplewood, with its harsh, untamed, breathtaking beauty, its long, unforgiving collective memories, and its complicated, interwoven, inescapable tapestry of past hurts and present fragile hopes, was where she would make her stand. This was where she would fight for her future, for her daughter, for the chance to finally, truly, authentically come home. The spring that eventually grudgingly crept into the high secluded mountain valleys around Maplewood wasn't a gentle, demure, passive thawing. It was a hard-won, defiant, almost insolent victory of tenacious, irrepressible life over the stubborn, entrenched, seemingly eternal dominion of ice and snow. Patches of vibrant, almost shockingly bright green pushed their way with stubborn, joyful insistence through the rapidly retreating sun-cupped snowdrifts, and the air, once sharp, brittle, and painfully cold, now carried the damp, loamy, promising scent of awakening earth and the delicate, elusive perfume of early brave wildflowers. The Hartwell cabin, no longer a brooding, decaying Gothic symbol of past dread, inherited shame and potential violence, but a testament to painstaking, loving restoration and resilient, hard-earned hope, gleamed with fresh, welcoming paint, its newly glazed, perfectly fitted windows reflecting the bright, optimistic, healing sunlight, its sturdy, newly mended fences, a quiet, unobtrusive symbol of boundaries, redrawn defenses rebuilt, and futures courageously, painstakingly reclaimed. Lily, though, still prone to days of quiet, pensive introspection, moments when the dark shadow of past hurt and betrayal would resurface sharp and sudden, as an unexpected squall began to seek out Vivian, with increasing, though still cautious, frequency. She shared small, hesitant, almost shy confidences, asked tentative, probing questions about the enigmatic, terrifying, powerful Alistair, the grandfather she had never known, the man who had tried to erase her existence. Slowly, cautiously, like a wary fawn stepping into a sunlit clearing, she began to explore the complex, often painful, multi-layered tapestry of her maternal heritage, a heritage of both privilege and profound dysfunction. She discovered in Vivian not the cold, monstrous, abandoning figure of her initial grief-stricken anger, but a flawed, surprisingly resilient, deeply wounded woman grappling with her own formidable demons. A woman who, she was slowly, hesitantly beginning to believe, loved her fiercely, imperfectly, but undeniably with a love that had survived 15 years of enforced silence and unimaginable pressure. One sun-drenched, surprisingly warm, late spring afternoon, as Jack and Vivian worked companionably side by side in the nascent, hopeful vegetable garden they had painstakingly carved from the rocky, unforgiving soil behind the restored Hartwell cabin, and their hands brushing occasionally, sending small, unexpected jolts of awareness through Vivian as they planted rows of fledgling tomato and squash starts. Lily approached them. She walked with a new quiet confidence, her earlier almost palpable anxieties and defensiveness tempered by a growing internal sense of self-possession, of belonging. In her hand, she clutched not a sketchbook or a scrap of paper bearing song lyrics, but a small, rather awkwardly wrapped package, tied simply with a piece of ordinary garden twine. Inside, nestled carefully on a bed of soft, vibrant green moss, Lily had clearly gathered from the woods, was a small, slightly lopsided, hand-carved wooden robin. A clear, if somewhat rudimentary and endearingly clumsy imitation of the treasured, perfectly crafted bluebird Jack had carved for her all those years ago. The wings were a little crooked, the paint job a bit uneven, but it was infused with an unmistakable, heartfelt intentionality. It's not very good." Lily mumbled, her cheeks flushing a becoming shade of dusty rose, her gaze fixed steadfastly on her worn, mud-stained sneakers. "The wings are a bit crooked, and I nearly sliced my thumb off about 3 times trying to get the beak right." But I thought your mantelpiece, Vivian. Inside your new old house, it looked a little bare. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Vivian picked up the small, imperfect bird, her fingers tracing its rough, earnest, lovingly carved lines. Tears, unexpected, overwhelming, and profoundly cleansing, welled in her eyes, blurring the vibrant, joyful colors of the nascent garden around them. Tears not of sorrow or regret, this time not anymore, but of a profound, almost unbearable, heart-stopping gratitude. "It's perfect, Lily," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed emotion, making it almost impossible to speak. It's the most beautiful, most precious, most meaningful thing I've ever seen." She looked from Lily's shy, hopeful, anxious face to Jack's quiet, warm, knowing smile. And in that single, suspended, sunlit moment, surrounded by the rich, life-affirming scent of damp earth, burgeoning life, and the distant, resinous perfume of the pine forest, she felt a profound sense of rightness, of homecoming, of a deep, resonant peace that had eluded her for an entire lifetime. Jack watched them, a slow, gentle, infinitely tender smile spreading across his weathered, handsome face, crinkling the corners of his kind, discerning eyes. The mountain still held its secrets, its mood still capricious, powerful, and unpredictable. The winters would undoubtedly return demanding and harsh. Healing, he knew from long, hard experience, was not a destination, but an ongoing, often arduous, sometimes faltering journey, a daily act of courage and commitment. But here, in this quiet, sun-drenched, unexpectedly sacred corner of Maplewood, amidst the lingering, fading whispers in the snowdrift and the vibrant, undeniable promise of new, tenacious growth, a family, forged in unimaginable fear, brutally tested by storm and irrevocably tempered by the shared refining crucible of near-fatal adversity, was finally, truly, irrevocably coming home. The long, dark, oppressive shadow of Alistair Hartwell still loomed on some distant, unseen, menacing horizon, a potential superstorm gathering its forces yet to break. Later that very evening, as the three of them shared a simple meal in the restored cabin, the robin perched proudly on the mantel Vivian's satellite phone. Silent for days, rang with Hale's chillingly familiar blocked number. She answered it, her hand steady now, Jack and Lily watching her with quiet support. "Vivian." Hale's voice was as devoid of emotion as ever. "Your father has reviewed your unconventional stance. He has instructed his legal team to initiate proceedings immediately. They will explore all avenues, your fitness to manage Hartwell assets, the legality of Mr. Callahan's guardianship of what my client considers stolen property, and your suitability as a maternal figure. Expect service within days. He also asked me to convey that he finds your choice of rustic decor regrettable." Vivian looked at the small wooden robin, and then at Lily's brave, anxious face, then at Jack's steady, reassuring one. "Tell my father, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice calm, clear, and resonant with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, "that I am ready. Tell him we are all ready. And tell him that some things, like a child's handmade gift, are more valuable than his entire empire. We'll see him in court. Or perhaps," she added, a hint of her old corporate steel returning, "he'll see us on the front page when the true story of Hartwell family values finally breaks. Your choice." She ended the call, a faint smile playing on her lips. For the first time in her life, Vivian Hartwell felt strong enough, anchored by the unwavering love of her daughter and the steadfast, unwavering presence of the man beside her, to stand firmly in the warm, life-giving sun, to face whatever storm her father unleashed. She was no longer just an heiress running from her past or a victim of her father's tyranny. She was a mother, a survivor, a fighter, and a woman ready to carve out her own future, her own legacy in the wild, untamed, beautifully resilient heart of the mountains.